Because the supply and demand model is used so frequently in economics, and certainly we can use it in markets which do not have perfect competition, but a lot of times when people rely on a supply and demand analysis, they're sort of assuming a perfectly competitive market in their mind. And so it's a good idea to sort of think about which markets are closer to perfect competition and which markets aren't, right? And so, in order to have a perfectly competitive market, these are sort of the four things that we're assuming. One is that the good or service being exchanged is homogeneous. That means it's exactly the same. And so we've already noted a few markets in which that might be a reasonable assumption. If we're talking about the market for wheat or soy or corn or steel or aluminum, those are homogeneous goods for the most part. Um, it's interesting to think about which goods might be homogeneous but might not be. So, for example, if we think about mixed concrete, that seems like a good that is perfectly homogeneous. And yet, a supplier of mixed concrete in Seattle is not competing with a supplier of mixed concrete in Dallas or Boston. And the reason is that the good is just too expensive to ship, right? And so if you need mixed concrete in a construction job in Boston, you're not going to contact a seller in Seattle or a seller in Dallas. So that's a market where you might think, oh, well, the good or service is homogenous, but it's really not, right? That market is very much a local market as opposed to, say, a national market. And that means that, with that type of market, it has a limited number of potential buyers and sellers. And one of the other requirements for perfect competition is that we have a large number of potential buyers and sellers. And that's because we need to make sure that all buyers and sellers are price takers. Nobody has enough market power to change the price by him or herself. And that's true in some markets, not others. Again, if we think about farmers, that traditionally has been the case, although farmers are getting larger and larger, and so they may, end up with some market power. We think about something like steel or oil. Well, those are good examples of, lots of homogeneous goods. And one of the reasons that monopolies developed in the late 19th century was so that firms could have some market power because they found that competition was eliminating all of their profits. And so we ended up with things like US Steel and Standard Oil, trusts, as we called them at the end of the 19th century, that basically became monopolies, became the only seller, and were in a market that was no longer perfectly competitive. Buyers and sellers all have to act independently of one another, so they can't act together in order to, change the price or quantity. So, for example, if sellers can get together to raise the price, then they're sort of acting like a single firm. Usually, if there are lots of sellers and buyers, then it's difficult to coordinate, and so if we have the second requirement of large numbers of buyers and sellers, then often we will have them acting independently of each other. And then the last one is really important. It's that price information is easily available to buyers and sellers, right? So if I'm in the market for a good that is homogeneous, in which there are lots of buyers and sellers and they're all acting independently, but I only know about one particular seller, and that particular seller knows that I have no information about anybody else who is selling, then that seller can raise the price and act as if the firm is selling a differentiated product with a downward sloping demand curve. And that can be really important. And so you could certainly argue that one of the benefits of the internet and online shopping is that it's much easier to price shop, although there's a lot of evidence out there that buyers still do not do a lot of price comparisons when they're buying certain goods and services. So if we have all four of those requirements, then we would expect to have a law of one price. And the law of one price says that all transactions take place at a single price, right? Right at that equilibrium where the demand curve and supply curve meet, where the quantity demanded is equal to the quantity supplied. And that's where the market clears. And in that case, buyers and sellers are all price takers. They're all accepting that one price. buyers are saying, okay, that's the price in the market. Sellers are saying, I can't do anything else. I have a flat demand curve. And in that case, all potential gains from trade are realized, which means that it's an efficient outcome, right? Now, while perfect competition may not hold in most markets, right, because of lack of information or some market power, it can sometimes be a very good approximation of actual firm behavior. And so that's why it's such a useful model, even though we need to remember that it comes with a number of caveats. So, how useful a model is it? Is there evidence of perfect competition? And so, sort of, we can look at two different tests in order to see if markets are perfectly competitive. Do all trades take place at the same price? And are firms selling goods at a price equal to marginal cost? Um, it's really hard to find evidence for those two things, right? As I said, even when it's pretty easy to check prices, for consumers don't always do it, and so prices of the same product differ. You think about people buying airline tickets for different prices, people buying electronics for different prices. I mean, just go on to Google Shopping and you can look for a product and you'll see it selling at lots of different prices. And the only way to make sense of those different prices is that the firms that are charging the higher price are selling to somebody, right? If they weren't selling to somebody, they would have to drop their price to the market price. Um, so there's a story in the book, the Fulton Fish Market Study, that even within the same market, right, where people are selling fish and buying fish at the same time, the prices were differentiated, right? Sellers were trying to price differently depending on how they viewed consumers' demand. So if we think about the difference between price setters and price takers, so price setters are really what we had in chapter 7, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a monopoly, right? It just means that there's less competition. In that case, the marginal cost is less than price, so there are positive economic profits. There's some deadweight loss, right? It's not Pareto efficient, whereas in price takers, marginal cost equals price, and so there's no deadweight loss. We expect no economic rents in the long run for price takers because if there are economic rents in the short run, firms will enter the market and those economic rents will fall, those economic profits. Whereas in a market in which there's less competition, owners can receive economic rents in both the long term and the short term. We expect firms to advertise their unique product with price setters, right? And a lot of times the only differentiation really between the product is advertising and brand, right? If you think about Coke versus Pepsi, they're basically the same product, and yet they both have some market power because of their brand power. Whereas in price takers and perfect competition, there's really no incentive to advertise, right? If you are a wheat farmer, there's no incentive for you to advertise wheat because people are going to buy your competitor's wheat just as much as your wheat, and so everybody would benefit. What you do sometimes see is trade organizations getting together to advertise. So that gives you, advertisements for milk or beef or pork. But individual firms will not advertise, and there's little incentive for innovation, especially with new products. That said, there could be some incentive for innovation to reduce your marginal costs, right? Because if you are in a perfectly competitive market in which, and you can get a lower marginal cost than your competitor, if you're both selling at the same price, then that gives you the opportunity to earn economic profits as opposed to your competitor with a higher marginal cost who is not earning economic profits. But a lot of price setters will have an incentive to invest in research and development. And this was one of the arguments of Joseph Schumpeter, who was an economist in the early and mid 20th century, who said that we shouldn't focus so much on this ideal of perfect competition. What we actually want is competition, but with some economic profit, some incentive to earn economic profits, because that will give firms the incentive to invest in both making their products more unique and also of reducing marginal costs, and that's really what drives economic growth. So if we just summarize chapter 8 here, it's a model of price-taking firms, right? Of perfect competition where all firms are selling the same product. There's lots of firms, there's lots of buyers. We end up where demand equals supply, which is a Pareto efficient outcome. Marginal cost is equal to price. And we can really use this model to show what happens when there's a shock to either supply or demand, or both. I should note that if both supply and demand change, you can always find out what happens to one variable, either price or quantity, but the other variable will be indeterminate. And so unless you have exact formulas for the demand and supply curve, you won't know exactly what happens to one of those variables. We can also look at the effect of taxation and how that affects surplus, efficiency, government revenue. And we said the most important thing with taxation is to look at the relative elasticity of demand and supply.